A millionaire asked a children's home for the most unwanted twins, and here's who they gave him. Two silent little girls, hiding a bond so deep, even the bravest families had turned them away. But when he tries to separate them, the house fills with screams that shake him to his core. Beneath their broken smiles hides a haunting secret that ties them to his darkest past. Now, faced with the ghosts of betrayal and a choice that could destroy them all, will he walk away again, or finally fight for the family he never knew he needed? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Rudolph Cross opened his eyes to the dim light of a winter morning. The sheets on his king-sized bed were crisp and cold beside him, untouched for years. Outside his bedroom window, snow fell in gentle flakes, coating the sprawling grounds of his estate in white. The mansion that had once seemed like a symbol of his success now felt like nothing more than an elaborate tomb. Tick, tick, tick. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway echoed through the empty rooms. Rudolph sighed and swung his feet to the floor, his slippers waiting in the exact same spot they were every morning. Everything in its place, everything perfect, everything hollow. Another day, he whispered to no one. The marble floors of his bathroom were heated, the shower pressure perfect, the coffee machine in his kitchen programmed to have his morning brew ready precisely when he arrived downstairs. Yet as Rudolph moved through his morning routine, the gnawing ache in his chest only grew stronger. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous rooms filled with expensive furniture that no one but him ever saw. And that concludes our fourth quarter projections, the presenter droned, clicking to the final slide. Thanks to Mr. Cross's acquisition of Hartley Industries, we're looking at a 15% increase over last year's numbers. Polite applause filled the conference room. Rudolph nodded, offering the tight smile he had perfected over years of business meetings. It was the smile that revealed nothing of the emptiness inside him. "Brilliant move, Rudolph," said a board member, clapping him on the shoulder. "Just business," Rudolph replied, gathering his papers. As the room emptied, his assistant Martin Greaves approached, tablet in hand. "Your schedule for the rest of the week, sir," he said, passing the device to Rudolph. "Though if I might suggest, you haven't taken a vacation in 3 years." Rudolph's eyes flicked up. "A vacation to where, Martin? And with whom?" He handed the tablet back. "Schedule the Thompson meeting for Thursday. I'll review the Morgan proposal tonight." Martin's concerned expression didn't change. "Sir, even the most efficient machines need maintenance." "I'm not a machine, Martin." Rudolph stood, straightening his tie. "I'm just a man who prefers to stay busy." The sleek black Mercedes purred along the country road as Rudolph drove aimlessly, something he found himself doing more often lately. The business conference had left him feeling particularly empty today. Another success, another acquisition, another meaningless victory. A small, weathered sign at the side of the road caught his eye. St. Adelaide's Children's Home, 1 mile ahead. Rudolph frowned, slowing the car. He had no connection to any children's home. He had no connection to children at all. Yet something about the sign tugged at him, like a half-remembered dream. Before he could analyze his own actions, Rudolph found himself turning onto the narrow driveway that led to a modest brick building. Snow covered the playground equipment in the yard, making it look like something from a Christmas card. Rudolph pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, turned off the engine, and sat in silence. Why was he here? What did he expect to find? He had no answers, only the strange certainty that he needed to walk through those doors. Rudolph Cross pushed open the heavy wooden door of St. Adelaide's Children's Home. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside, but there was something else in the air. A mixture of industrial disinfectant and something heavier, something that reminded him of his own childhood. Sorrow, perhaps. Resignation. A woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun looked up from her desk. Her eyes narrowed as she took in his expensive coat and polished shoes. "May I help you?" Her voice was as crisp as the winter air outside. "I'm Rudolph Cross," he said, stepping forward. No recognition flickered in her eyes, which was unusual. Most people knew his name, his face, his fortune. "Sister Margaret Doyle, I run this facility." She didn't offer her hand. Are you here about a donation? The office hours for that are— I'm not here to donate, Rudolph interrupted, surprising even himself with his next words. I'm here about adoption. Sister Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. Well, Mr. Cross, adoption is a lengthy process. There are home studies, background checks, waiting periods. I understand the process. Rudolph's voice was firm. He stood straighter, falling into the commanding presence that had served him well in boardrooms. I want to see the children. Which children specifically? Sister Margaret asked, her wariness evident. Rudolph paused, the words forming in his mind before he could analyze them. Give me the children nobody else wants. Sister Margaret stared at him, her expression unreadable. That's an unusual request, Mr. Cross. Nevertheless, it's mine. His gaze didn't waver. After a long moment, Sister Margaret sighed. There are two. Twin girls. Hope and Hannah. They've been returned from 3 foster homes already. The last family said they were— She hesitated. Unsettling. Unsettling how? They don't speak much, they draw constantly. The same things over and over. Sister Margaret glanced at her watch. It's nearly sunset. They'll be in the playroom now. Rudolph nodded. Take me to them. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with children's artwork and motivational posters that had faded with time. The building was clean, but worn, like a sweater that had been washed too many times. Sister Margaret stopped at a door with a small window. Through it, Rudolph could see a room bathed in the golden-orange light of sunset. Various toys were scattered about, but his eyes were drawn to the far corner, where 2 small figures sat hunched over pieces of paper. They're 7 years old, Sister Margaret whispered. They've been with us on and off since they were 3. Their mother ... She trailed off, shaking her head. Well, she's not in the picture. She pushed open the door and Rudolph followed her into the dimly lit playroom. The twins didn't look up at their entrance. They continued drawing on torn pieces of paper, their movements nearly identical. Hope, Hannah, Sister Margaret called softly. There's someone here who would like to meet you. Slowly, 2 small faces turned toward them. Rudolph felt something shift inside his chest as he looked into their solemn eyes. Identical pairs of deep brown that seemed far too old for their young faces. The girls stared at him without speaking, their expressions neither welcoming nor rejecting. They simply watched, as if waiting to see what kind of disappointment he would turn out to be. Rudolph Cross took a tentative step toward the twins, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the worn linoleum floor. The sound made both girls flinch. They were so small, he thought. Much smaller than 7-year-olds should be. Their matching dark blue dresses hung loosely on their thin frames. Hello, he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. I'm Rudolph. Hope's arm shot out protectively around Hannah's shoulders, pulling her sister close until they were pressed together like 2 pages of a book. Hannah's wide eyes never left Rudolph's face, studying him with the wary calculation of someone much older. There was no childish curiosity there, only distrust. They don't warm up quickly, Sister Margaret explained from behind him. It might be better if you— It's fine, Rudolph interrupted, crouching down to their level. I understand caution. The girls remained frozen, their small hands clutching identical worn-colored pencils. Rudolph noticed their drawings. Both featured a house with a red door and what appeared to be 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a large sun. The artwork was nearly identical, as if they had coordinated without speaking. Perhaps, Rudolph suggested, turning to Sister Margaret, we could speak with them separately? I'd like to get to know each of their personalities. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Hope's face contorted in terror. Hannah's mouth opened in a silent gasp. Then, as if triggered by the same invisible switch, both girls erupted into screams that seemed to come from somewhere primal and wounded. The sound bounced off the walls of the small room, raw and desperate. They collapsed into each other. Hope's arms wrapped around Hannah so tightly her knuckles turned white. Hannah buried her face in her sister's neck, their bodies shaking violently as their screams continued. Sister Margaret rushed forward, kneeling beside them. "It's all right. It's all right," she repeated, though her words had no effect. "No one is going to separate you. I promise." Rudolph stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd heard cries of distress before, from business partners he'd ruined, from employees he'd fired, but nothing like this. This was the sound of pure terror. Slowly, the screams subsided into hiccuping sobs. The twins remained entwined, rocking slightly, their eyes squeezed shut against whatever horrors they imagined. "Let's step outside," Sister Margaret said quietly to Rudolph, her face grim. In the hallway, with the door closed behind them, Sister Margaret leaned against the wall. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than before. "Every family that's tried to foster them has attempted to separate them at some point," she explained solemnly. "For school assessments, for doctor's appointments, even for simple things like bath time. The results are always the same: violent emotional collapse, sometimes self-harm. The last family returned them after Hannah stopped eating for 3 days when they put Hope in a different bedroom." Rudolph glanced through the small window at the twins, who were now silent but still clinging to each other. "Their case files suggest severe abandonment trauma," Sister Margaret continued. "Whatever happened before they came to us, well, they've decided never to be apart again." Rudolph stood silently, his tall frame blocking the exit. Sister Margaret's implication was clear. He would need to take both or walk away entirely. There was no separating them, no choosing one over the other. He stared at the two small figures huddled in the corner of the playroom, and for the first time in years, Rudolph Cross felt something crack open inside his chest. Rudolph Cross stared at the adoption papers spread across the desk, the harsh fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across every line and signature space. His expensive fountain pen felt unusually heavy in his hand. He'd signed countless business contracts worth millions of dollars without hesitation, but these simple forms made his heart pound. "Are you certain about this, Mr. Cross?" Sister Margaret asked, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp with concern. "Taking on 2 children, especially these 2, isn't like acquiring a company." Rudolph pressed his lips together and signed his name with a decisive stroke. The black ink glistened momentarily before drying into the paper, making it official. "I'm certain," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Something about those girls had reached into the empty chamber of his chest and found something he thought had died years ago. Sister Margaret gathered the papers, her movements deliberate and slow. As she organized them into a folder, she leaned closer to Rudolph. "They need each other more than they need the world," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Remember that when things get difficult, and they will get difficult." Rudolph nodded stiffly, uncomfortable with the warning but unwilling to show it. Within the hour, Hope and Hannah sat in the back seat of Rudolph's sleek black car, their small backpacks, containing everything they owned in the world, clutched tightly on their laps. Rudolph adjusted his rearview mirror, catching glimpses of their solemn faces. They hadn't spoken a single word since he'd told them they were coming home with him. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the soft purr of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. Rudolph cleared his throat several times, attempting to think of something appropriate to say, but no words came. Halfway through the journey, Hannah began to hum. It wasn't a recognizable tune, just a sad, wandering melody that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The sound raised the hair on Rudolph's arms. Hope stared out the window, her small hand firmly clasped in her sister's. "We're almost there," Rudolph finally said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet car. Neither girl responded. The gates to his estate swung open automatically as they approached. Rudolph watched in the mirror as the twins' eyes widened at the sight of the sprawling mansion, its windows glowing amber against the darkening sky. "This is home now," he said as he parked in front of the grand entrance. The girls climbed out silently, still holding hands, their faces unreadable as they took in the enormous house. Inside, Rudolph stood awkwardly in the foyer, suddenly realizing he had no idea what to do next. He'd purchased a house with 6 bedrooms, but had never considered filling any of them with children. He had no toys, no children's books, nothing that might make these silent, haunted girls feel welcome. "Your rooms are upstairs," he said, gesturing vaguely. "You can choose whichever ones you like." Hope and Hannah exchanged a look that seemed to contain an entire conversation. Without a word, they turned in opposite directions. Hope heading toward the east wing of the house, Hannah toward the library in the west. They moved like ghosts, their small feet making no sound on the polished marble floors. Rudolph stood alone in the center of his mansion, watching them disappear into separate corners of his vast, empty home. A cold feeling settled in his stomach as he realized he had no idea how to reach them, how to care for them, or how to heal whatever had been broken inside them. He had wanted to fill the emptiness in his life, but now he feared he'd only expanded it. The days stretched into weeks, and Rudolph Cross found himself completely unprepared for the reality of raising two traumatized children. Every morning began with the same ritual. Rudolph would knock gently on their bedroom door. They had insisted on sharing one room despite having the entire mansion to choose from, and receive only silence in return. "Breakfast is ready," he would announce through the door, his voice awkward and stiff. Sometimes they would appear at the table, often they wouldn't. When they did eat, Hope would carefully arrange her food into patterns but rarely consume it. Hannah would watch Rudolph with unblinking eyes while methodically tearing her toast into tiny pieces. The sound of breaking dishes became alarmingly common, plates slipping from small hands or being deliberately pushed from the table. "I'm sorry," Rudolph would say, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. The girls never responded. They developed a talent for disappearing. Rudolph would turn around to find empty chairs where children had been sitting moments before. He'd search the endless corridors of his mansion, calling their names, his voice echoing back to him from empty rooms. Sometimes he'd find them huddled in closets or beneath beds, whispering secrets to each other that fell silent the moment he appeared. One Tuesday morning, Rudolph entered the kitchen to find Mrs. Langford, his longtime housekeeper, whispering urgently to the gardener. "Must be cursed, I tell you. No normal children act this way. Yesterday I found them standing in the upstairs hallway, just staring at the wall for 20 minutes without moving. It's unnatural." Rudolph cleared his throat loudly. Mrs. Langford jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Cross, I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly," Rudolph said coldly. "I won't have that kind of talk in my house, Mrs. Langford. Those girls have been through more than you can imagine." "Yes, sir," she murmured, but her eyes darted nervously toward the doorway as if expecting to see the twins materialize there. Rudolph couldn't entirely blame her. There was something increasingly unsettling about the way the mansion felt since the girls had arrived. Objects moved without explanation. Doors that had been closed were found open. The sound of soft footsteps could be heard at odd hours pattering down hallways where no one stood. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of deep purple, Rudolph entered his library to find something that made his blood run cold. Across the pristine, cream-colored walls were dozens of childish drawings done in crayon and marker. Twisted, disturbing images covered the expensive wallpaper. A woman with tears streaming down her face, a house engulfed in flames, and everywhere, broken hearts, cracked and bleeding. Hope stood in the center of the room, a red crayon clutched in her small fist, her eyes vacant and unreadable. Hannah lurked in the doorway, hugging a tattered teddy bear missing one eye, its stuffing leaking from a torn seam. "What is this?" Rudolph asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Neither girl answered. Hope simply stared at him, while Hannah clutched her bear tighter, her knuckles turning white with the effort. The mansion suddenly felt like it wasn't his anymore, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the girl's pain and reflecting it back in these disturbing images. That very night, the sky turned black as ink. Thunder boomed like angry giants stomping across the heavens. Rain lashed against the windows of Rudolph Cross's mansion with such fury that it sounded like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry. The wind howled through the trees, bending their ancient trunks and sending branches scraping against the roof. Inside, Rudolph paced the long hallways, checking windows and doors. The mansion creaked and groaned under the assault of the storm. Suddenly, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the enormous house into darkness. "Perfect," Rudolph muttered, fumbling in his pocket for his phone to use as a flashlight. The beam cut weakly through the darkness. "Hope?" "Hannah?" he called out, his voice nearly drowned by another crash of thunder. No answer came. Rudolph felt his heart rate quicken. Where were they? The thought of the twins wandering alone in the pitch-black mansion filled him with unexpected dread. He searched room after room, calling their names. The storm's fury intensified, making the massive house feel small and vulnerable. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating empty rooms and casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. After checking the library, the kitchen, and their bedroom, Rudolph finally entered his own room. At first glance, it appeared empty. Then, a tiny whimper, so soft he almost missed it, drew his attention to the space beneath his king-sized bed. Rudolph dropped to his knees and directed his phone's light under the bed. Two pairs of wide, frightened eyes reflected the beam back at him. Hope and Hannah were curled together in the dusty space, trembling like autumn leaves in a gale. "It's okay," Rudolph said softly, extending his hand. "It's just a storm. It can't hurt you." Neither girl moved. They pressed closer together, and Rudolph noticed something glinting between them, something metallic clutched tightly in Hannah's small fist. "What's that you have there?" he asked gently. Hannah's fingers tightened around the object, but Hope gave her sister a barely perceptible nod. Slowly, reluctantly, Hannah extended her shaking hand. In her palm lay a delicate silver locket, its chain tangled around her fingers. Rudolph carefully untangled the chain from Hannah's grip. The metal was warm from being clutched so tightly. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the locket. Neither girl spoke, but they didn't pull away either. Rudolph took that as permission. As midnight approached, the storm still raged outside. Rudolph sat on the floor of his bedroom. The twins huddled nearby, wrapped in thick blankets he'd brought from the linen closet. The beam of a flashlight he'd found in a drawer illuminated the small circle they formed on the carpet. With careful fingers, Rudolph opened the locket's clasp. Inside was a tiny photograph, worn at the edges but still clear. A woman with high cheekbones and a cryptic, unsettling smile stared back at him. But it was her eyes that made Rudolph's breath catch. Eyes exactly like Hannah's, with the same unusual amber flecks. They were hauntingly familiar, though Rudolph couldn't place why. "Is this your mother?" Rudolph asked quietly. Hope and Hannah remained silent, their faces unreadable in the dim light. But their eyes never left the photograph, as if the woman might somehow emerge from it if they watched long enough. Rudolph looked back at the picture, studying the woman's face. This was the first real clue about the twins' past, a past that seemed to haunt every corner of his mansion now. Earlier that day, before the storm had gathered its fury, Rudolph Cross had been sitting in Sister Margaret Doyle's cramped office, signing the final adoption papers. His pen had scratched across countless forms, his signature becoming increasingly mechanical. While he'd been flexing his cramping fingers, he'd noticed something odd. Sister Margaret, thinking he was distracted, had quickly slipped a folded paper into the thick manila folder containing the twins' records. "What was that?" Rudolph had asked, his businessman's instincts immediately alert. Sister Margaret's face had remained carefully blank. "Just standard documentation, Mr. Cross. Nothing to concern yourself with." But Rudolph had seen the flash of worry in her eyes. She'd closed the folder too quickly, handed him his copy of the adoption papers, and ushered him out with unusual haste. Now, as the storm rattled the windows of his mansion and the twins finally slept, curled together on his bed after their fright, Rudolph found himself restless. The locket with the mysterious woman's photograph lay heavy in his pocket. The thunder outside matched his growing unease. Something wasn't right. Sister Margaret had hidden something from him. Rudolph made his way downstairs, the flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The kitchen was eerily quiet, the usual hum of appliances silenced by the power outage. He went straight to the drawer where he'd hastily stashed the adoption file earlier that week, not having had the time or inclination to file it properly. The drawer slid open with a soft scrape. Rudolph pulled out the thick folder and laid it on the kitchen counter. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the room better than his flashlight. He thumbed through the paperwork, medical records, school evaluations, mostly blank, psychological assessments, disturbing in their conclusions. And there it was, A folded, yellowed letter tucked between the twins' birth certificates. The paper was worn at the creases as if it had been opened and refolded many times. In faded blue ink, the words, "To prospective guardian," were written across the front. Rudolph's heart beat faster as he unfolded the letter. He adjusted his flashlight, focusing the beam on the cramped handwriting that filled the page. "To whom it may concern," the letter began. "If you are reading this, you have chosen to take responsibility for Hope and Hannah. You deserve to know what we could not include in official records." Rudolph's eyes widened as he read on. The letter, written by a previous caretaker at a different facility, detailed a disturbing history. The twins' mother, the woman in the locket, had left a trail of destruction behind her. She had committed countless acts of fraud, swindling vulnerable people out of their savings. She had assumed multiple identities, deceived everyone she encountered, and finally abandoned her own daughters without a backward glance. "Authorities suspect she left the country," the letter continued. "She showed no remorse for leaving her children. They were found alone in a motel room, having been there for 3 days without food. Hope was trying to feed Hannah sugar packets dissolved in tap water." Rudolph's hands trembled as he read the final paragraph. "The psychological damage to the children is severe. They trust no one. They speak primarily to each other, and they fear, above all else, being separated. Whatever you do, keep them together. They have survived only because they had each other." Rudolph looked up from the letter, his mind reeling with this new information. The mysterious woman in the locket wasn't just the twins' mother. She was a dangerous criminal who had abandoned her children without a second thought. Rudolph stood frozen in his darkened kitchen, the letter trembling in his hands. The flashlight beam wavered across the yellowed paper as memories long buried began to surface. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in his mansion during a thunderstorm in the present day. In his mind, he was transported back to the summer of 1965, when he was just 26 years old. The memory was so vivid he could almost feel the warm summer breeze on his face. Young Rudolph had been lean and hungry then, building his business from nothing, full of dreams and ambition. His office had been a tiny rented space above a hardware store, not the gleaming skyscraper he owned now. And into that humble office had walked Miriam Vale. She had been breathtaking, raven-haired with eyes that seemed to change color in different lights, sometimes green, sometimes blue, always mesmerizing. Her smile had lit up his dingy office, and when she spoke about her charity for orphaned children, her passion had seemed so genuine it brought tears to his eyes. "These children have nobody," she had told him, her hand resting lightly on his. "Nobody to fight for them. Nobody to love them. I want to change that, Rudolph. And I think you're the kind of man who could help me." Rudolph remembered how her words had pierced his heart. He'd grown up wealthy but emotionally neglected, with parents who showed their love through checks rather than embraces. Miriam's cause had spoken to the lonely child still living inside him. Over the course of 3 months, he had fallen completely in love with her. He had written check after check for her foundation. He had introduced her to his business associates, vouched for her character, opened doors for her fundraising efforts. And all the while, she had looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see into his soul, had kissed him with lips that whispered promises of a future together. Then one morning, she was gone. His calls went unanswered. Her apartment was emptied. The charity office was vacant, the lease paid in cash. The bank account he had helped her establish for the foundation had been drained of over $300,000, a fortune in those days, representing nearly everything he had. The police investigation revealed there was no charity, no orphanage being built. There were only other victims across 3 states, all telling the same story of a beautiful, passionate woman who had disappeared with their money and left their hearts in tatters. Rudolph had rebuilt his fortune through sheer determination and a newly hardened heart. He had never spoken of Miriam Vale again. He had never trusted anyone with his heart again. Now, standing in his kitchen with thunder crashing outside, Rudolph lifted the locket with shaking fingers. He stared at the tiny photograph inside, the woman with the enigmatic smile, the chameleon eyes. Miriam Vale. The woman who had destroyed his ability to trust. the woman who had abandoned her own daughters in a motel room. Hope and Hannah's mother. The realization hit him like a physical blow. These traumatized, silent little girls upstairs were connected to him by the cruelest twist of fate. Their mother had conned and abandoned him years before she had done the same to them. A loud crash shattered the silence of the mansion, jerking Rudolph back to the present moment. The locket slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the kitchen floor as another crash followed by a heart-wrenching wail echoed through the hallway. "No, no, come back," a child's voice cried out. Rudolph raced up the grand staircase, his heart pounding against his ribs. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the corridor in harsh flashes as he sprinted toward the twins' bedroom. He flung open the door to find a scene of chaos. Hope was thrashing wildly in her bed, her small body tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. Her eyes were open but unseeing, locked in the grip of a night terror. The bedside lamp lay shattered on the floor, the source of the crash he'd heard. She promised. Hope sobbed, her voice raw with anguish. She promised she would come back. Mommy promised. Rudolph rushed to her side, carefully avoiding the broken glass. He hesitated for just a moment before placing his hands gently on Hope's shoulders. "Hope, it's okay. You're safe," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm here. You're not alone." Hope's eyes remained unfocused, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "She said she'd be back after lunch. She said it was just for a little while." Rudolph felt something crack inside his chest. The same lies, the same abandonment. Miriam Vale had walked away from him with similar empty promises, just as she had later walked away from her own daughters. Across the room, Hannah sat rigidly in the corner, clutching her tattered teddy bear so tightly that its stuffing bulged from a torn seam. She rocked back and forth, her eyes wide with terror, watching her sister's nightmare unfold. The teddy bear's one remaining button eye seemed to stare accusingly at Rudolph. "It's all right," Rudolph said, gathering Hope into his arms as her thrashing subsided into trembling. "I've got you." To his surprise, Hope collapsed against him, her small fingers clutching his shirt as though he were a lifeline in a stormy sea. Rudolph held her awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. He looked over at Hannah, who had stopped rocking but continued to watch with wary eyes. "You too," he said softly, extending his free arm. "Come here." Hannah didn't move for a long moment. Then, with the teddy bear still clutched to her chest, she slowly crossed the room and allowed Rudolph to draw her into his embrace. As he held both girls, Rudolph felt a revelation wash over him. It didn't matter whose blood ran in their veins. It didn't matter what Miriam Vale had done to him or to them. What mattered was that these two small, wounded souls needed something he had the power to give: stability, security, and love. The storm raged on through the night. Rudolph stayed with the twins, telling them quiet stories until they drifted back to sleep. He remained in the chair between their beds, watching over them as the hours passed. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Rudolph was still there, exhausted but filled with a new sense of purpose. As the sun rose, painting the room in soft golden light, he made a silent vow beside their beds. "I will never abandon you," he whispered, "no matter what blood runs in your veins." The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Rudolph stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes. It had been 3 weeks since the night of the storm, and every morning since then, he had risen early to prepare breakfast for the twins. He arranged the pancakes in the shape of smiley faces, adding blueberry eyes and strawberry smiles. "Hope? Hannah?" "Breakfast is ready," he called softly, placing the plates at the table. The twins appeared in the doorway, still in their matching pajamas, their eyes wary but curious. They slid into their chairs without a word. Rudolph noticed that Hannah picked up her fork, poking gently at a blueberry. "It's okay if you don't want to eat it all," Rudolph said, sitting down with his own plate. "I'll keep making breakfast every morning, no matter what." Hope looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For 21 days, the girls had barely touched their food, but Rudolph persisted. Today, Hannah lifted a tiny bite of pancake to her lips. It was progress, small but significant. "I have some work to do in my office," Rudolph said, keeping his voice casual. but I'll be right down the hall if you need anything." Later that afternoon, Rudolph sat at his desk reviewing documents when he heard a soft scratching at his door. Rising quietly, he opened it to find the hallway empty, but there on the floor lay a piece of paper. Rudolph picked it up, his heart catching in his throat. The drawing was simple, 3 stick figures holding hands. The tallest wore what appeared to be a tie, while the 2 smaller figures had pigtails drawn in different colors. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, was written, "Us." Rudolph clutched the drawing to his chest, emotion overwhelming him. He carefully pinned it to his bulletin board where he could see it while he worked. Over the next hour, 2 more drawings appeared, slipped silently under his door. One showing the 3 figures in what looked like the garden, another with them sitting at the breakfast table. When he stepped into the hallway after the 3rd drawing, he caught a glimpse of Hannah darting around the corner, her small feet barely making a sound on the carpet. That evening, Rudolph sat in his study making a phone call, his voice low and serious. "Dr. Marks, thank you for taking my call. I've recently adopted twin girls who have experienced significant trauma. They need professional help beyond what I can provide." On the other end of the line, Dr. Lillian Marks, a renowned child psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, listened carefully. "The girls are showing small signs of trust, but there's so much beneath the surface," Rudolph continued. "Their mother abandoned them, and I believe they've never properly processed that loss." "I understand, Mr. Cross," Dr. Marks replied. "Children who've experienced abandonment often struggle with forming new attachments. Your consistency is exactly what they need right now." "When can you start seeing them?" Rudolph asked, relief evident in his voice. "I can come to your home this Friday. Sometimes familiar surroundings help children feel safer during initial sessions." Rudolph thanked her and hung up, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't alone in this anymore. With Dr. Marks's help, perhaps Hope and Hannah could begin to heal their hidden wounds. Days turned into weeks as spring bloomed across the mansion grounds. Rudolph stood by the kitchen window, watching as Hope and Hannah explored the garden. Dr. Marks had been visiting twice weekly, and though progress was slow, it was undeniable. Rudolph had filled the garden with colorful flowers and a small fountain. Today, he'd brought out a bottle of bubbles, something Dr. Marks suggested might help the girls connect with simple joys. "Would you like to try?" Rudolph asked, kneeling beside Hope and demonstrating how to blow through the plastic wand. Hope took the wand cautiously, her small lips pursed in concentration. When the first stream of iridescent bubbles floated upward, catching the sunlight, something magical happened. Hope laughed. It was brief, a short, surprised sound that escaped before she could catch it, but it was unmistakably a laugh. Rudolph froze, afraid that any movement might break the spell. Hannah looked equally startled, her eyes wide as she stared at her sister. "That was beautiful," Rudolph said softly, his heart swelling. "Would you like to try again?" Hope nodded, a tiny smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she dipped the wand back into the soapy solution. That evening, as Rudolph prepared to say goodnight to the twins, Hannah appeared in the doorway of her bedroom, clutching something to her chest. It was a battered book, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. "Would you—" Hannah's voice was so quiet Rudolph had to lean closer. "Would you read this?" Rudolph recognized the velveteen rabbit in her small hands. The book had clearly been loved, or perhaps it was one of the few possessions the girls had managed to keep through their many foster homes. "I'd be honored," Rudolph said, careful to keep his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Hannah climbed into bed beside Hope, who was already tucked under the covers. Rudolph sat on the edge, opening the treasured book that Hannah had pulled from her secret box kept under her bed. "There was once a velveteen rabbit," Rudolph began reading, "and in the beginning, he was really splendid." By the time he reached the part about becoming real through love, both girls had nestled closer, their eyes heavy with approaching sleep. Rudolph continued reading until soft, even breathing told him they had drifted off. That Sunday afternoon, Rudolph sat in his study reviewing the notes Dr. Marks had left after her last session. The doorbell rang, and Martin delivered an elegant cream envelope on a silver tray. "Special delivery, sir," Martin said. Rudolph opened it to find an embossed invitation. "Mr. George Langston requests the pleasure of your company at the annual Children's Future Foundation Gala." Rudolph's jaw tightened. George Langston, his former business partner and longtime rival, the man who had built his empire by taking Rudolph's ideas and claiming them as his own. The invitation represented everything Rudolph had once valued: power, influence, networking opportunities. Before the twins, he would have attended without question, seeing it as another battlefield in their ongoing competition. Now, looking at the invitation, Rudolph felt torn. The gala was scheduled for next Saturday, the same night he had promised to take Hope and Hannah to see the new children's play at the community theater, their first outing as a family. Rudolph set the invitation down, feeling the weight of his old life pulling against his new one. This would be a test of his resolve, of the promises he had made to two little girls who were just beginning to trust him. Rudolph stood before the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his bow tie with practiced fingers. The black tuxedo fit perfectly, as always. Downstairs, Hope and Hannah were having dinner with Mrs. Langford, blissfully unaware of his internal struggle. "It's just one night," he told his reflection. "George will think I've gone soft if I don't show." Rudolph had promised the girls they would go to the community theater on Saturday. But this was Thursday. Surely they wouldn't mind if he stepped out for a few hours. The charity gala represented connections, opportunities, and a chance to remind George Langston that Rudolph Cross was still a force to be reckoned with. Mrs. Langford appeared in the doorway, her hands clasped at her waist. "The girls are asking for you, sir. They want to know if you'll read to them before bed." Rudolph checked his watch. The gala had already started. "Tell them I have an important business event. I'll read 2 stories tomorrow night." Mrs. Langford's lips thinned with disapproval. "Very well, sir." As Rudolph descended the stairs, he heard a small voice call out, "Mr. Cross?" Hannah stood at the bottom of the staircase, clutching her teddy bear. "Are you leaving?" "Just for a little while," Rudolph said, his voice softer than he intended. "I have an important meeting." "Will you come back?" Hannah's voice trembled. The question pierced Rudolph's heart. "Of course I'll come back, I promise." Hannah nodded solemnly, but her eyes remained doubtful. The charity gala was everything Rudolph expected: crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the elite of the city dressed in their finest. George Langston spotted him immediately, crossing the room with a predatory smile. "Rudolph, I wasn't sure you'd make it. Heard you've been playing house lately." Rudolph forced a smile. "Just broadening my horizons, George." As the evening wore on, Rudolph found himself checking his watch repeatedly. The conversations about stock portfolios and property acquisitions that once energized him now felt hollow. His mind kept drifting back to the mansion, wondering if Hope and Hannah were sleeping peacefully or lying awake, worried he might never return. A waiter offered him another glass of champagne, but Rudolph waved it away. The opulence surrounding him suddenly felt suffocating rather than impressive. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Mrs. Langford's number flashed on the screen. "Excuse me," he said to no one in particular, stepping away from a group of investors. "Mr. Cross?" Mrs. Langford's voice was tight with panic. "There's been an accident. Hope fell from the stairs. She was looking for you, sir. Crying for you. The ambulance just took her to Memorial Hospital. She has a fractured wrist." The world around Rudolph seemed to freeze. "I'll be right there." Without a word to anyone, Rudolph pushed through the crowd toward the exit. George Langston stepped into his path. "Leaving so soon? The major donors haven't even arrived yet." "My daughter is in the hospital," Rudolph said, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly right on his tongue. George's eyebrows shot up. "Your daughter? Come now, Rudolph. We both know this adoption is just another one of your charity projects. You'll tire of playing daddy soon enough." Rudolph stared at his old rival, seeing for the first time the emptiness behind George's eyes, the same emptiness that had lived in his own heart for so long. "You're wrong," Rudolph said quietly, "and I feel sorry for you." Without another word, Rudolph hurried into the night, his only thought reaching Hope's side as quickly as possible. After a while, Rudolph Cross sat beside Hope's bed at the hospital, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his guilt. The antiseptic smell filled his nostrils as he watched her tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows across her pale face, making her look even smaller and more fragile than usual. Her fractured wrist was wrapped carefully in a white bandage, resting on top of the starched hospital sheets. Hannah sat on the other side of the bed, her eyes never leaving her sister's face. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived at the emergency room. When Hope's eyelids fluttered open, Rudolph leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Hope? How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Hope's lips trembled as she looked up at him with wide, wounded eyes. "Did you leave because we are bad?" Her small voice cracked with emotion, each word striking Rudolph's heart like a physical blow. Right then and there, Rudolph Cross fell to his knees beside the hospital bed. The polished businessman disappeared completely as tears welled in his eyes. He gently took Hope's uninjured hand in his own. "No, no, no," he whispered fiercely. "You girls are not bad. You are wonderful and perfect, and so, so good." His voice broke. "I'm the one who was bad. I made a terrible mistake by leaving you tonight. I'm so sorry, Hope. I'm so sorry, Hannah." Hannah slid off her chair and moved closer, her small fingers clutching Rudolph's coat tightly, refusing to let go. Her knuckles turned white with the force of her grip, as if she feared he might disappear again if she released him. "I promise," Rudolph continued, looking from one girl to the other. "I will never leave you again. Not for business, not for money, not for anything in this world." He swallowed hard. "You two are what matters most to me now." A nurse with kind eyes stepped into the room, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Cross? We can discharge Hope in the morning if she continues to do well overnight." Rudolph nodded, never taking his eyes off the girls. "Thank you. I'll be staying right here with them." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital windows as Rudolph signed the discharge papers with a steady hand. The nurse reviewed Hope's care instructions while Hannah hovered anxiously nearby. "Remember to keep the cast dry," the nurse explained gently, "and she'll need to come back in 2 weeks for a checkup." Rudolph thanked her and carefully gathered Hope into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her small body curling trustingly against his chest. Hannah clutched his hand as they walked toward the exit. As Rudolph carried Hope through the hospital doors into the bright morning sunshine, he made a silent vow that no event, no business deal, no charity gala, no amount of money or prestige would ever come before these children again. They were his family now, and he would protect them with everything he had. In those days following the accident, Rudolph Cross threw himself into transforming the mansion with a passion that surprised even him. Every morning, he woke before dawn, sketching plans and making phone calls to contractors. His business meetings went unattended, his emails unanswered. Nothing mattered except creating a safe haven for Hope and Hannah. "What do you think of this color?" Rudolph asked one afternoon, holding up paint swatches in soft lavender and sky blue. Hope pointed shyly to the blue while Hannah touched the lavender with her fingertip. "Both," Rudolph decided with a smile. "One wall of each color." He converted an entire wing of the mansion into what the contractors began calling the Twins' Paradise. Rudolph supervised every detail himself, painting walls in cheerful colors, building sturdy wooden bunk beds with his own hands, and installing a playroom filled with books, art supplies, and soft, comfortable furniture. He hung fairy lights from the ceiling that twinkled like stars when the room grew dark. "Is this really all for us?" Hope asked one day, her eyes wide as she stood in the doorway of the completed playroom. Rudolph knelt beside her. "All of it. This is your home now." Hannah, who rarely spoke, touched his arm gently. "Forever?" she whispered. "Forever," Rudolph promised, his throat tight with emotion. During one of the final renovations, while installing a new ceiling fan in what had once been a nursery, Rudolph discovered a small, hidden door in the ceiling. Hope and Hannah watched with wide eyes as he pulled down a folding ladder. "Should we explore?" he asked them, extending his hands. The girls nodded eagerly. Together, they climbed into a dusty attic space that hadn't been opened in decades. Sunlight streamed through a small round window, illuminating stacks of old trunks, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, and boxes of forgotten treasures. "Look!" Hope called out, pointing to an ornate wooden chest. Rudolph brushed away layers of dust to reveal his family name carved into the wood. Inside, they found old photographs, baby clothes, and a small, leather-bound book with a broken clasp. "That was my mother's diary," Rudolph said softly, lifting it from the chest. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it. Hannah leaned against his side, her small hand resting on his arm as if offering comfort. Later that day, after tucking the girls into their new bunk beds for an afternoon nap, Rudolph sat alone in his study with the diary. The pages were brittle with age, the handwriting elegant but hurried. He turned to a random entry and began to read. July 10th, 1947. Rudolph cried for me again today, but I couldn't bear to hold him. Every time I look into his eyes, I see only my failures reflected back. I know I'm abandoning him emotionally, just as my mother did to me. The cycle continues and I am too weak to break it. Rudolph closed the book, his hands shaking. Tears blurred his vision as he recognized the painful truth. His own mother had been trapped in the same pattern of emotional abandonment that he had nearly continued with Hope and Hannah. "No more," he whispered fiercely, looking toward the wing where the twins slept peacefully. "The cycle ends with me." He placed his mother's diary carefully on the shelf and walked to the twins' room, determined to stand guard over their dreams, to be present in every moment, to break the chains of abandonment that had bound his family for generations. Soon after the discovery in the attic, Rudolph scheduled therapy sessions with Dr. Lillian Marks for Hope and Hannah. The small, warm office with its colorful rugs and shelves of toys should have been inviting, but the twins huddled together on the couch, their shoulders touching, eyes downcast. "It's perfectly normal to feel nervous," Dr. Marks said gently, her voice soft and melodic. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun. "We can just sit quietly today if you'd like." Rudolph sat in a chair nearby, his heart aching as he watched Hope grip Hannah's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Neither girl spoke a word during the entire 45-minute session. "This will take time, Doctor," Marks told Rudolph afterward, while the twins waited in the reception area. "Children who've experienced abandonment build walls to protect themselves. Our job is to show them those walls aren't needed anymore." The second session went much like the first, silence from both girls. The third and fourth as well. Rudolph began to wonder if they would ever open up, but Dr. Marks remained patient and unfailingly gentle. "They're watching us," she explained, testing to see if we'll give up on them like others have. As time went on during their sixth session, something changed. Hope reached for the box of crayons on the small table between them and began to draw. Hannah watched her sister intently, but didn't join in. Dr. Marks didn't comment, simply continued talking softly about how brave they both were, while Hope's small hand moved across the paper with determination. When she finished, Hope slid the drawing across the table toward Dr. Marks. It showed a broken clock, its hands fallen off, its face cracked down the middle. "This is beautiful work, Hope," Dr. Marks said. "Would you like to tell me about it?" Hope shook her head no, but the next session she drew again, this time a weeping willow tree with tears falling from its branches into a puddle below. By the 10th session, Hope had created an entire collection: a boy standing alone in an empty house, a bird in a cage, two small figures holding hands while surrounded by darkness. Each drawing was carefully executed, each one a coded message about abandonment and fear. "She's communicating," Dr. Marks told Rudolph. "This is significant progress." Rudolph kept each drawing, placing them carefully in a portfolio he bought specially for Hope's art. He would sit with her in the evenings, watching as she created new images, never pushing her to explain them, but always present, always attentive. Then, during their 12th session, something extraordinary happened. Dr. Marks had placed Hope's latest drawing, two small girls standing at a window watching rainfall, on the table between them. "It feels lonely," Dr. Marks observed quietly. Out of nowhere, Hope's voice emerged, so soft they almost missed it. "We thought everyone leaves, like Mama did." The room fell silent. Hannah's eyes widened at her sister's words. Rudolph felt his breath catch in his throat. Dr. Marks maintained her composure, though her eyes briefly met Rudolph's in a knowing glance that confirmed how deeply rooted the twins' pain truly was. "That must have been very frightening," Dr. Marks said gently. Hope nodded, her small shoulders trembling slightly as Hannah pressed closer to her side. Rudolph Cross pulled his sleek black car into the gravel parking lot of St. Adelaide's Children's Home, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The modest brick building looked smaller than he remembered, its faded sign creaking slightly in the autumn breeze. He had left Hope and Hannah with Mrs. Langford, promising to return before dinner. This was a journey he needed to make alone. The questions that had kept him awake for nights demanded answers. Why had Sister Margaret Doyle seemed so reluctant to let the twins go? Why had she called them special cases, with that look of concern in her eyes? Most importantly, why had no one wanted these children before him? Sister Margaret's office smelled of lemon polish and old books. She greeted him with surprise in her eyes, gesturing toward a worn wooden chair across from her desk. "Mr. Cross, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Are the girls—" "The girls are fine," Rudolph interrupted, settling into the chair. "They're making progress. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless." Sister Margaret nodded, relief softening her features. "I'm glad to hear it." "What I need to know," Rudolph said, leaning forward, "is why they were labeled unadoptable. What happened to these children before they came here?" The older woman's face clouded. She removed her glasses, polishing them slowly with the edge of her cardigan as if buying time. "Mr. Cross, I told you they were special cases." "That's not an answer," Rudolph pressed. "They're having nightmares. They draw pictures that would break your heart. I need to know what I'm dealing with." Sister Margaret sighed deeply, replacing her glasses. "Very well. You deserve to know." She hesitated, then continued in a quieter voice. "Hope and Hannah were adopted once before, about 3 years ago. A wealthy couple from Boston, childless, desperate for a family. They seemed perfect on paper." Rudolph felt a chill creep up his spine. "What happened?" "They returned the girls within 4 months," Sister Margaret said, her voice tight with old anger. "Claimed there were strange incidents. Said the girls would whisper to each other at night in some language they couldn't understand. Said they found them standing silently at the foot of their bed at 3 a.m. The wife became convinced they were—" She paused, clearly uncomfortable. "Somehow dangerous." "Dangerous?" Rudolph echoed in disbelief. "They're 7-year-old girls." "They're children who've been traumatized," Sister Margaret corrected firmly. "They were fighting to stay together in the only ways they knew how. The couple wanted to separate them, thought it would help them adjust better. When the girls resisted, the situation deteriorated quickly." The pieces clicked into place in Rudolph's mind. The twins' terror when he'd suggested meeting them separately, their silent communication, their fierce protectiveness of each other. As dusk fell, Rudolph sat alone on a bench outside the children's home, watching the sky turn from blue to deep purple. The truth settled heavily in his chest. Hope and Hannah weren't dangerous. They were survivors. They were simply children fighting desperately to stay together in a world that kept tearing them apart. Every strange behavior, every silent moment, every midnight wandering through his mansion, it was all part of their battle to remain unified against a world they couldn't trust. Rudolph checked his watch. It was almost dinner time. The girls would be waiting. The doorbell rang through the mansion just as Rudolph was helping Hope with a simple puzzle. His brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting visitors. Hannah looked up from her coloring book, her eyes instantly wary. "It's okay," Rudolph assured them, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "Stay here. I'll be right back." He strode to the front door, opened it, and felt his heart stop. Standing on his doorstep was a face he hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. His sister, Elena Cross. Her dark hair was shorter than he remembered, streaked with a few strands of silver. She clutched a weathered suitcase in one hand. "Hello, Rudy," she said softly, using the childhood nickname that no one had called him in decades. Rudolph stood frozen, a storm of emotions crossing his face. "Elena? What are you doing here?" Elena's eyes were tired but determined. "I'm sorry, Rudy. For everything. For staying away so long." She took a deep breath. "I heard you adopted children. I thought, maybe you could use some help." Before Rudolph could respond, two small faces peered around his legs. Hope and Hannah stared up at the strange woman, their identical expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Who are you?" Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. Elena knelt down, bringing herself to their eye level. "I'm Elena, Rudolph's sister. That makes me your aunt." She smiled gently. "And who might you two be?" "I'm Hope," said one twin, pointing to herself. "And that's Hannah." Rudolph found his voice at last. "Girls, this is unexpected. Elena and I haven't seen each other in a very long time." "Too long," Elena added softly. "May I come in, Rudy? I think we have a lot to talk about." That evening, dinner was a revelation. Elena sat between the twins, showing them how to fold their napkins into swans. Hope giggled, actually giggled, when her swan collapsed into a crumpled heap. Hannah watched intently as Elena demonstrated again, her small fingers mimicking the folds. After dinner, Elena pulled colorful ribbons from her bag. "Would you like me to braid your hair?" she asked. The twins nodded eagerly. Rudolph watched in amazement as his sister's fingers worked magic, weaving Hannah's hair into an intricate braid while telling stories about woodland fairies. Hope waited patiently for her turn, smiling more freely than Rudolph had ever seen. "Again!" Hope demanded when Elena finished, her eyes bright with joy. Later that night, after the twins were tucked into bed, Rudolph and Elena sat in the library, 2 glasses of whiskey between them. "They're wonderful, Rudy," Elena said. "Broken but wonderful." Rudolph nodded. "Why now, Elena? Why after all these years?" Elena stared into her glass. "I saw a photograph in the society pages. You with those girls." She took a shaky breath. "And I knew." "Knew what?" "That they were hers. Miriam's children." Elena's voice cracked. I recognized something in their faces. Rudolph set down his glass, stunned. "How would you know what Miriam's children look like?" "Because she took from me too, Rudy." Tears filled Elena's eyes. "Different con, same woman. She pretended to be a literary agent. Took everything I had saved for my bookstore. I was too ashamed to tell you, especially after how I dismissed your pain when she hurt you." Rudolph sat back, pieces falling into place. Their estrangement, her sudden disappearance from his life, the returned letters, the unanswered calls. "All these years," he whispered, "we were both carrying the same wound." "Different cuts," Elena corrected, "from the same knife." The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Rudolph stood on the back patio, carefully arranging kindling in the stone fire pit. This had been Elena's idea, a simple backyard bonfire to celebrate their first week together as a family. "Need any help?" Elena asked, stepping outside with a tray of graham crackers, chocolate bars, and a bag of marshmallows. "Almost done," Rudolph replied, striking a match. The flame caught quickly, dancing across the dry wood. Hannah appeared at the back door, clutching her tattered teddy bear. "Is it ready?" she asked, her voice still quiet but no longer fearful. "Almost," Rudolph smiled. "Where's Hope?" "Getting the sticks," Hannah said, pointing to Hope, who emerged carrying 4 long roasting sticks she'd found in the kitchen. As dusk settled around them, the 4 gathered close to the crackling fire. Elena showed the twins how to roast marshmallows, turning them slowly to achieve the perfect golden brown. "Not too close to the flame," she instructed gently. "Patience makes them perfect." Hope's marshmallow caught fire immediately. She pulled it back, watching with wide eyes as it turned black and began to drip. "It's ruined," she whispered, disappointment evident in her voice. Rudolph laughed softly. "Not ruined, just well done. Some people prefer them that way." He blew out the flame and helped her sandwich it between graham crackers and chocolate. "Try it." Hope took a cautious bite, sticky marshmallow stretching between her lips and the s'more. Her eyes widened with delight. "It's good," she exclaimed, chocolate smearing across her cheek. Hannah giggled at her sister's messy face, a sound that still surprised Rudolph every time he heard it. She carefully turned her own marshmallow, determined to achieve perfection. As the twilight deepened, Elena began telling stories from their childhood, tales of Rudolph as a boy, building forts in the woods and rescuing injured birds. The twins listened, entranced, occasionally glancing at Rudolph as if seeing him in a new light. "Did you really climb all the way to the top of that tree?" Hannah asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "I did," Rudolph nodded, "and got grounded for a week afterward." Hope laughed, the sound bubbling up naturally now. Rudolph watched them, these two small girls who had entered his life like ghosts, but were now vibrant with life. The mansion behind them, once so empty and cold, now seemed to glow with warmth. This, Rudolph thought, is what a home feels like. Not the expensive furniture or the priceless art, but these people, this moment, this feeling of belonging. Something fluttered into his lap, interrupting his thoughts. A paper airplane, folded from one of Hope's drawing papers. Rudolph carefully unfolded it, smoothing the creases. On the paper were 4 stick figures holding hands in a circle. One tall male figure labeled Rudy, one female figure with Aunt Elena written beneath, and 2 smaller figures clearly meant to be Hope and Hannah. Around them, a large heart encircled the group. Rudolph looked up to find Hope watching him anxiously, waiting for his reaction. He felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It's beautiful," he managed, his voice thick. Elena leaned over to see the drawing and gasped softly. "Oh, Hope," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Hannah nodded solemnly. "We made it together," she said. "It's our family." Our family. Rudolph had spent his life accumulating wealth, yet nothing had ever felt as valuable as this simple drawing, this moment, these people. Here, in the glow of a backyard fire, he had found what money could never buy. After a while, Rudolph Cross found himself settling into a comfortable routine with Hope, Hannah, and Elena. Mornings began with pancakes shaped like animals, afternoons were filled with games in the garden, and evenings ended with stories by the fireplace. The mansion that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with childish laughter and the warm sounds of family. On a bright Tuesday morning, Rudolph sat at his desk reviewing the twins' school enrollment paperwork when Mrs. Langford appeared at the door. "Mr. Cross, there's a Jonathan Pierce here to see you. He says it's important." Rudolph frowned. Jonathan Pierce was an old business associate he hadn't spoken to in months. "Send him in," he said, tucking away the school forms. Jonathan strode into the office with the confident air of someone who rarely heard the word no. His tailored suit and polished shoes spoke of recent success. "Rudolph, my friend," Jonathan exclaimed, extending his hand. "It's been too long." "Jonathan," Rudolph replied, shaking his hand firmly. "This is unexpected." From the doorway came the soft padding of small feet. Hope peered around the doorframe, curious about the visitor. "And who might this be?" Jonathan asked, his smile widening. "This is Hope," Rudolph said, gesturing for her to come in. "Hope, this is Mr. Pierce, a business associate." Hope nodded shyly but remained by the door. "I've heard rumors you've become a family man," Jonathan said, his eyes assessing Hope with calculated interest. "2 little girls, is it?" "Yes," Rudolph answered cautiously. "Hope and her sister Hannah." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "We should catch up properly. I have something that might interest you enormously." Later that day, after lunch with the family, Rudolph met Jonathan in his study. The older man wasted no time getting to the point. "The Davenports want to meet with you," Jonathan announced, watching Rudolph's reaction carefully. Rudolph raised his eyebrows. The Davenport family owned one of the largest shipping companies on the East Coast. "What for?" "They're looking to merge with a technology firm. Your firm, specifically." Jonathan leaned forward. "This could be the deal of a lifetime, Rudolph. The kind that secures generational wealth." Rudolph felt a familiar stirring of ambition. His company had been struggling lately, and this partnership could change everything. "There's something else," Jonathan added, his voice dropping. "The Davenports recently lost their daughter. Tragic accident. They've been looking to adopt a child, a girl specifically." He paused meaningfully. "I mentioned your situation. They seemed interested." Rudolph's blood ran cold. "My situation?" "Two identical girls must be challenging," Jonathan said smoothly. "The Davenports could provide an exceptional life for one of them. Private tutors, international travel, every advantage money can buy." "They want to adopt one of the twins?" Rudolph asked, his voice hardening. Jonathan nodded. "They were quite clear, one child only. They don't want the complications of siblings." He glanced around the study. "In return, they'd ensure the merger goes through. Your financial troubles would vanish overnight." In the silence that followed, Rudolph felt the pull of his old ambition warring with his love for the girls. The deal would rescue his investments, secure his future. But at what cost? Separating Hope from Hannah, the very thing he had promised never to do. "Think about it," Jonathan urged. "This opportunity won't come again." Earlier that day, Rudolph Cross had sat in the third row of the elementary school auditorium, his heart swelling with unexpected pride. The annual spring concert was underway, and Hope and Hannah stood side by side on the risers, matching blue dresses and white ribbons in their hair. When their class began to sing, Rudolph found himself leaning forward, straining to hear their small voices among the group. The song was a simple lullaby about belonging and family, with lyrics that spoke of safe places and forever homes. As the children sang about never being alone again, Rudolph noticed something that made his throat tighten. Hope and Hannah weren't looking at their music teacher or even at the audience as a whole. Their eyes searched the crowd until they found him, and then their gazes locked onto his face as if he were the only person in the room. In that moment, Rudolph saw the truth written plainly in their expressions. He had become their anchor, their safety, their world. Elena, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. "They're singing just for you," she whispered. Later that evening, Rudolph stood in the doorway of the twins' bedroom, watching as they drifted off to sleep. They lay facing each other, their small fingers intertwined beneath the blanket Elena had knitted for them. Even in sleep, they couldn't bear to be separated. The weight of Jonathan Pierce's proposal pressed down on Rudolph's shoulders like a physical burden. The Davenports wanted one child, only one. The thought of tearing apart those intertwined fingers made him feel physically ill. "They're finally asleep," Elena whispered, coming to stand beside him. "They were so excited about their performance today. Did you see how they kept looking at you?" Rudolph nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, noticing his expression. "You've been quiet all evening." "It's nothing," he lied. "Just business matters." Elena studied his face for a moment before nodding. "I'm turning in. Don't stay up too late worrying about whatever it is." After she left, Rudolph retreated to his study. His computer chimed with an incoming email just as he sat down. The sender's name made his heart skip. Margaret Davenport. With a sense of dread, he opened the message. "Dear Mr. Cross, my husband and I were deeply moved by Jonathan's description of your situation. We understand the challenges of raising two children alone, especially given your business commitments. We would like to offer you $10 million in a private arrangement for the adoption of one of your twins. This would be entirely confidential, with paperwork handled through our personal attorneys to ensure discretion. Our daughter Emily's passing has left a void that can never truly be filled, but we believe one of your girls could find happiness in our home, with every advantage money can provide. Please consider our offer carefully. This could secure both your future and hers. Sincerely, Margaret Davenport." Rudolph stared at the screen, his hands trembling. $10 million. A personal fortune that would solve every financial problem he faced. And all it would cost was breaking apart two little girls who clung to each other even in their dreams. At midnight, Rudolph Cross paced the marble floors of his mansion, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The house felt both too large and too small at the same time, too vast in its emptiness, too confining with the weight of his decision. The email from Margaret Davenport glowed in his mind like a neon sign. $10 million. Financial salvation. All he had to do was tear apart two little girls who had already lost everything once before. He paused at the large window overlooking the garden, where just days ago, Hope and Hannah had chased butterflies, their laughter filling the air. Elena had been right. He hadn't been himself since Jonathan's visit. The business empire he'd built was crumbling, investments failing one after another. The Davenport offer would save everything he'd worked for. "What kind of man am I becoming?" he whispered to his reflection in the darkened glass. Unable to find peace, Rudolph made his way to the twins' bedroom. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Hope and Hannah slept peacefully, their small chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Even in sleep, they remained connected, Hannah's hand resting on Hope's arm as if afraid her sister might disappear. Rudolph knelt beside Hope's bed, adjusting her blanket. As he did, he noticed the corner of a book peeking out from her nightstand drawer. Curious, he gently slid it open. Inside lay a worn spiral notebook with Hope's special book, written in crooked crayon letters on the cover. He knew he shouldn't look, but something pulled him to open it. Right then and there, Rudolph Cross felt his heart splinter. Page after page held the same image, two small stick figures, always holding hands. Hope had drawn them in different places, by a house, under a sun, beside a tall stick man he recognized as himself. But in every picture, the two girls were connected, their stick arms linked together. Some pages showed darker scenes, two small figures huddled in corners, surrounded by looming, shadowy adults. Others showed the girls alone in what looked like a large building with many windows, the children's home. But always they were together. Rudolph's hands trembled as he turned to the final page. A piece of lined paper had been taped inside, with words written in Hope's careful, childish handwriting. "If one of us go, the other will break forever." All of a sudden, the full weight of what he'd been considering crashed down on Rudolph. These weren't just two separate children he could divide like assets in a business deal. They were two halves of one whole, keeping each other alive through a bond forged in abandonment and pain. Tears spilled down Rudolph's cheeks as he carefully returned the notebook to its hiding place. The girls' breathing remained steady, unaware of the battle that had just ended in their father's heart. "No amount of money," Rudolph whispered, looking at their peaceful faces, "could ever be worth breaking you." In that moment, standing between the twin beds of his daughters, Rudolph Cross faced the emotional point of no return. He knew with absolute certainty that he would burn every dollar, sacrifice every asset, before he would separate Hope from Hannah. On that very night, Rudolph Cross sat outside on the wooden porch swing, the cool midnight air washing over his face. His fingers clutched Hope's crayon diary to his chest like a shield against the darkness. The moon hung heavy and full above the sprawling estate that had once seemed so important to him. "I thought I might find you out here," came Elena's soft voice as she stepped through the screen door. She carried two steaming mugs of tea, offering one to her brother. Rudolph accepted it wordlessly, making room for her on the swing. The gentle creaking of the chains filled the silence between them. "I saw the Davenport email," Elena finally said, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line. $10 million is a lot of money." Rudolph's knuckles whitened around the mug. "It is. And it would save everything you've built." "Yes." His voice was barely audible. Elena turned to face her brother, her expression illuminated by moonlight. "But no amount of money could repair the heartbreak of betrayal, Rudolph. Not for them. Not for you." Rudolph closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. "How did we get here, Elena? When did money become more important than people?" "Perhaps," she said, placing her hand gently on the diary he still clutched. "When we were children ourselves, watching our parents choose wealth over love time and again." They sat together in silence, the night wrapping around them like a blanket of shared memories and healing wounds. Later that night, Rudolph tossed in his bed, falling into a troubled sleep. In his dreams, he stood in a sterile hallway of a state institution. The walls were an institutional gray, the floors polished to a heartless shine. He followed a nurse down the corridor to a small room. There sat Hannah, older now, perhaps 16, staring vacantly out a barred window. Her once bright eyes were dull, her shoulders hunched in permanent defeat. She rocked slightly, clutching a tattered teddy bear. "She doesn't speak anymore," the nurse explained clinically. "Not since her sister was adopted. We've tried everything." In the dream, Rudolph reached out to touch Hannah's shoulder, but his hand passed through her like smoke. "Hannah," he called, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Hannah, I'm sorry." She turned slowly, looking right through him as if he weren't there. On her lap lay a faded crayon drawing of two stick figures holding hands. "She's waiting," the nurse said, "always waiting for her sister to come back." Rudolph woke with a gasp, just as the first rays of sunrise painted his bedroom in gold. Sweat dampened his forehead as the nightmare's images lingered. He sat up, watching the dawn break over his estate. The vast gardens, the swimming pool, the tennis courts, all the trappings of wealth that suddenly seemed so hollow. In that moment of clarity, Rudolph Cross knew exactly what he must do. The path forward crystallized with absolute certainty in his heart. He would rather lose every penny he owned, watch his business empire crumble to dust, than lose the precious trust that Hope and Hannah had placed in him. Some choices in life defined a person, and this was his. Rudolph Cross would choose love over wealth. He would choose family over fortune. He would choose to be the father these girls needed, not the businessman the world expected. Rudolph Cross stood before the mirror in his oak-paneled study, adjusting his silk tie with practiced precision. His reflection stared back at him, the perfect image of success in his tailored charcoal suit. Yet his eyes held something new, something that hadn't been there before Hope and Hannah entered his life. Back then, Rudolph Cross would have chosen ambition over anything: money, love, even family. The memory of his younger self rose vividly in his mind, working 18-hour days, canceling his mother's 70th birthday celebration to close a deal, cutting ties with childhood friends who couldn't benefit his rise to power. "Mr. Cross," his assistant had once said, "your sister called again about your father's health." "Tell her I'll call back when the merger is complete," he had replied without looking up from his documents. That was the Rudolph Cross who had built an empire. That was the Rudolph Cross who had missed his father's final days. That was the Rudolph Cross who had everything and nothing at all. Remembering this while preparing to meet the Davenports strengthened his new resolve. He glanced at the framed crayon drawing on his desk, two little girls holding hands with a tall stick figure labeled Dad, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that no business victory had ever provided. Later that day, Rudolph Cross walked into the lavish meeting room at the Davenport estate. The room exuded old money, mahogany furniture, oil paintings of stern ancestors, and crystal decanters filled with amber liquid. Mr. and Mrs. Davenport sat regally at the head of the table, their faces a careful mask of polite interest. "Mr. Cross," Charles Davenport began, extending his hand, "we appreciate your consideration of our proposal." Rudolph shook it firmly but said nothing. Their attorney, Mr. Hargrove, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, slid a thick document across the polished table. "We've prepared the final contract as discussed. $10 million transferred immediately to your accounts, with another 5 upon completion of the adoption." Mrs. Davenport smiled tightly. "We've prepared the most beautiful nursery. Our Hannah will want for nothing." Rudolph's heart clenched at her words. "Hannah," he repeated softly. "Yes," Mr. Hargrove continued, tapping a manicured finger on the contract. "One child, one fortune, no questions asked. Complete confidentiality, of course. The other twin need never know what became of her sister." The room fell silent as Rudolph picked up the contract, feeling its weight in his hands. He thought of Hope and Hannah sleeping with their fingers intertwined. He thought of their nightmares, their tears, their slow journey toward trust. At that moment, Rudolph Cross tore the contract in half without hesitation. Then he tore it again, letting the pieces flutter to the table like confetti. "I am not separating them," he said firmly, his voice steady and clear. "I am not for sale, and neither are they." The Davenports stared in shock. Mr. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "You don't understand what you're turning down," Charles Davenport finally sputtered, his face reddening. Rudolph stood, buttoning his jacket with calm dignity. "I understand perfectly. For the first time in my life, I understand what truly matters." The next morning, Rudolph Cross pulled into the long driveway of his mansion, watching as the grand house came into view. For the first time, it didn't feel like a cold monument to his success. It felt like home. His heart quickened as he parked the car and walked toward the front door, keys jingling in his hand. Before he could even turn the key in the lock, the door flew open. Hope and Hannah stood there, their small faces lighting up with pure joy. Something in their eyes told him they knew. They somehow sensed what he had done, what he had chosen. "You came back," Hope cried, her voice breaking with emotion. Without hesitation, both girls launched themselves forward, tiny arms wrapping around his waist, holding him with surprising strength. Rudolph dropped to his knees, gathering them both in his arms, breathing in the sweet scent of their shampoo. "I'll always come back," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Always." Hannah pressed her face against his shoulder, her tears dampening his expensive suit. He didn't care. For the first time in his life, Rudolph Cross understood what real wealth felt like, and it had nothing to do with money. Elena stood in the doorway, watching with glistening eyes. She nodded at her brother, a silent acknowledgement of the man he had become. Later that afternoon, Rudolph and Elena packed a simple picnic basket. They filled it with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, apple slices, and chocolate chip cookies that the twins had helped bake that morning. The kitchen still bore evidence of their baking adventure, flour dusting the countertops and sticky fingerprints on the refrigerator door. At the neighborhood park, they spread a checkered blanket beneath a sprawling oak tree. The autumn sky stretched above them in shades of gold and amber, leaves dancing on gentle breezes. Hope chased butterflies while Hannah collected colorful leaves, bringing each new treasure back to show Rudolph. "Look," Hannah said, holding up a crimson maple leaf. It was the most words Rudolph had heard from her in a single day. They ate their simple meal with more laughter than Rudolph could remember experiencing in years. Elena taught the girls how to make daisy chains, their small fingers working carefully under her guidance. "We're like a real family," Hope said suddenly, looking up at Rudolph with wide, earnest eyes. "We are a real family," Rudolph corrected gently, his heart swelling. Eventually, as the afternoon light began to soften, Rudolph reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a carefully wrapped package. He had stayed up late into the night working on it, something he hadn't done since grade school art class. "I have something for you both," he said, handing the gift to the twins. Together, Hope and Hannah unwrapped the present, their small fingers working in perfect synchrony. Inside was a framed drawing, Rudolph's attempt at their first family portrait. It was messy and childlike, with 4 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Underneath, in bold, uneven letters, he had written a single word: "Forever." "You made this?" Hope whispered, tracing the frame with her finger. Rudolph nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his artistic abilities. "I wanted you to know that this, us, it's not temporary. It's forever." Hannah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a hope that matched her sister's name. "Forever," she repeated softly, testing the word on her tongue as if tasting something precious and rare. As time went on, life settled into a comfortable rhythm at Rudolph Cross's home. The grand mansion that had once echoed with emptiness now buzzed with the sounds of family life. Each morning, Rudolph would wake early to prepare breakfast before the twins headed off to Oak Ridge Elementary School. The kitchen countertop now displayed a colorful calendar marked with school events, doctor appointments, and play dates. "Don't forget your science homework," Rudolph reminded Hope one Tuesday morning, sliding her lunchbox across the counter. He had learned to pack the perfect lunch, crusts cut off the sandwiches for Hannah, and apple slices arranged in a star pattern for Hope. Elena Cross had practically moved in, occupying the guest room 3 or 4 nights each week. Her presence brought a softness to the home that complemented Rudolph's structured approach to parenting. She taught the girls to braid their hair, and helped with the more delicate conversations that Rudolph still found challenging. "You're getting better at this dad thing," Elena told her brother one evening as they washed dishes side by side, watching the twins build a pillow fort in the living room. Rudolph smiled, the word dad still feeling new and precious. "I'm trying," he admitted. Later that week, Rudolph sat on the edge of Hope's bed during their nightly bedtime routine. He had just finished reading Chapter 3 of Charlotte's Web, the twins' current favorite story. Hannah was already tucked into her matching bed across the room, her eyelids growing heavy. Hope fidgeted with her blanket, her small fingers twisting the fabric. Something was clearly on her mind. "What is it, sweetheart?" Rudolph asked gently. Hope looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "When we grow up big," she began hesitantly, "will you still be our forever family?" The question hit Rudolph like a physical blow. Despite all the progress they had made, the fear of abandonment still lingered in these precious children. He glanced over at Hannah, who had perked up, waiting for his answer with the same anxious expression. Rudolph took Hope's small hand in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and firm. "You two are my family now. That doesn't change when you grow up or when you're old like me. Family is forever." Hannah slipped out of her bed and padded across the room, climbing onto Hope's bed to be part of the conversation. "But what if you change your mind?" she whispered, the rare sound of her voice underscoring the importance of his answer. At dusk, with the last rays of sunlight painting the bedroom in soft orange hues, Rudolph pulled both girls onto his lap. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small velvet boxes. "I want to make you a promise," he said solemnly. "Not only will you always have me, but I want to make it official, a family bound not just by heart, but by name." He opened the boxes to reveal 2 delicate silver bracelets, each engraved with the name Cross. "I've filed the papers to legally adopt you both," Rudolph explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Soon you'll be Hope Cross and Hannah Cross, my daughters. Forever." The twins' eyes widened, looking from the bracelets to Rudolph's face. "No one can ever take us away?" Hope asked. "No one," Rudolph promised. "We're going to be a family in every way possible." In the meantime, Rudolph Cross secretly planned a special adoption ceremony, timed for the twins' 7th birthday. He wanted the day to be more than just a legal formality. It needed to be a celebration that Hope and Hannah would remember forever. Late one evening, after the girls were asleep, Rudolph spread papers across his office desk and began making lists. The judge agreed to hold the ceremony in the garden instead of the courthouse, Rudolph told Elena, who sat across from him with a notebook. "I want it to feel magical, not institutional." Elena smiled, jotting down ideas. "We should have butterflies," she suggested. "The girls love them, and they're a perfect symbol of transformation." Rudolph nodded enthusiastically. "And those little lanterns they can release into the sky afterward." Dr. Lillian Marks joined their planning sessions, offering psychological insights to make the ceremony healing as well as joyful. "Include something that acknowledges their journey," she advised. "Children need their struggles validated before they can fully embrace new beginnings." Together, the 3 adults created a ceremony that would honor the past while celebrating the future. Rudolph commissioned a local artist to create a family tree with branches that could grow with the years. Elena arranged for a professional photographer to capture every moment. "They deserve to have these memories preserved," Rudolph said softly. "I want them to look back and know that this day was the real beginning." Later that day, Rudolph Cross sat at his mahogany desk, carefully writing his new legal name change papers. The afternoon sun streamed through the window as his pen moved deliberately across the official documents. He wasn't just adopting Hope and Hannah, he was allowing them to adopt him too. "Rudolph Hope Hannah Cross," he whispered, testing how it sounded. The name felt right on his lips. When Elena discovered what he was doing, tears welled in her eyes. "You're changing your name for them?" Rudolph looked up, his expression serene and certain. "They changed everything else about me. My name should reflect that." He smoothed the paper with his palm. This is my way of showing that they saved me as much as I saved them." "They'll never doubt your love after this," Elena said, squeezing his shoulder. Rudolph nodded. "That's the point. I want them to carry absolute certainty with them through life." At midnight, under a canopy of stars, Rudolph stepped out onto the garden terrace. The house behind him was quiet, with Hope and Hannah sleeping peacefully upstairs. In his hands, he held the completed paperwork, adoption forms for the twins and his own name change documents ready to be filed in the morning. The night air was cool against his face as he looked up at the vast, glittering sky. The same stars had witnessed his loneliness just months ago, and now they witnessed his transformation. "Thank you," Rudolph whispered to the heavens, his voice barely audible even to himself. He wasn't sure who or what he was thanking: fate, God, or simply the mysterious workings of the universe that had brought two small, wounded souls into his empty life. "They saved me," he continued in his hushed confession to the stars. "I thought I was rescuing them, but they rescued me first." A gentle breeze rustled the papers in his hands, and Rudolph felt a profound peace settle over him. Tomorrow would begin the legal process, but in his heart, they were already a family, bound by something stronger than blood or law. On that very night, the night before the birthday, Rudolph Cross tiptoed down the darkened hallway of his mansion. His arms were full of decorations, and his heart was full of excitement. The adoption papers were signed and ready, but he wanted everything to be perfect for the moment when Hope and Hannah would learn they were officially, legally, and forever his daughters. The door to the twins' bedroom creaked softly as Rudolph pushed it open with his elbow. In the pale moonlight streaming through the window, he could see the two small forms curled together on Hope's bed. They often started in their separate beds but ended up together, as if even in sleep they needed to be sure the other was still there. Rudolph smiled as he carefully placed his supplies on the floor. He unfolded a stepladder and climbed up, pressing the first glow-in-the-dark star to the ceiling. One by one, he created a galaxy above their beds, arranging the stars in the shape of their initials intertwined with his own. "Our family constellation," he whispered to himself, pressing the final star into place. Next, he unfurled the banner he had painted himself. His hands, once used only for signing contracts and counting money, had spent hours carefully forming each letter. "Our forever starts tomorrow," it read in bright, colorful letters. Rudolph hung it across the wall where the girls would see it first thing when they woke up. Later that night, Hope stirred in her sleep. Her eyes fluttered open to the soft sound of footsteps. Through half-closed lids, she watched as Rudolph knelt beside her bed. In his hands was a small velvet box. Rudolph placed the golden locket on her nightstand with gentle fingers. Hope could see it gleaming in the starlight, heart-shaped and new, nothing like the tarnished one that had once held her mother's picture. "For both of you," Rudolph whispered, thinking she was asleep. "A new beginning." Hope watched through her eyelashes as Rudolph carefully opened the locket to check its contents one last time. Inside was a tiny photograph of the three of them from their day at the park. Rudolph in the middle, a twin on each side, all three faces bright with laughter. It was the first picture where both girls had smiled without reservation. Rudolph closed the locket and placed it back on the nightstand before gently brushing a strand of hair from Hope's forehead. "Sleep well, my daughters," he murmured, before quietly leaving the room. Hope waited until the door closed before reaching out to touch the locket. She didn't open it. That was something she wanted to share with Hannah in the morning. But the cool metal under her fingertips felt like a promise. At sunrise, the backyard of the Cross Mansion buzzed with activity. Rudolph, Elena, and Dr. Lillian Marks moved with purpose, transforming the space into a wonderland of celebration. "The balloons go by the gazebo," Elena directed, pointing to the white structure decorated with flowers. "And the cake table should be in the shade." Rudolph nodded, carefully placing a 3-tiered birthday cake at the center of a long table. The cake was decorated with butterflies and the words, "Happy Birthday" and "Forever Family Day," written in flowing script. Dr. Lillian Marks arranged 7 photographs on an easel, one for each year of the twins' lives, with the final image being their first day with Rudolph. "This timeline was a wonderful idea," she told Rudolph. "It acknowledges their past while celebrating their future." Around them, the backyard filled with people who had become part of the girls' journey. Sister Margaret Doyle arrived with a gift wrapped in simple brown paper. Mrs. Langford, the housekeeper who had once whispered about curses, now hung streamers with enthusiasm. Even Martin Greaves, Rudolph's assistant, carried in boxes of party favors. "They're still sleeping," Elena reported, returning from checking on the girls. "Everything's ready. This will be a day they'll never forget." Rudolph looked around at the colorful balloons dancing in the morning breeze, the presents piled high on a table, and the faces of people who had come to celebrate two little girls who had once been labeled unwanted. "Perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." The moment arrived. Elena gently led Hope and Hannah through the French doors and into the backyard. The twins stepped outside, blinking in the morning sunlight, still in their matching blue pajamas. Their small hands were linked together as always, but suddenly they froze, their eyes growing wide with wonder. "Surprise!" shouted a chorus of voices. Before them stretched a wonderland of color. Balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze, streamers danced from tree branches, and a table piled high with presents stood beneath the oak tree. Faces they had come to know and trust, Elena, Dr. Lillian Marks, Sister Margaret Doyle, even Mrs. Langford, all beamed at them with genuine joy. But what made Hannah's breath catch and Hope's fingers tighten was the enormous banner stretched across the gazebo. "Welcome home forever," it proclaimed in bright, bold letters. Is this all for us?" Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. Rudolph stepped forward, his eyes shining with emotion. "Happy birthday, and something even more special." The party unfolded around them like a dream. Cake and games and laughter. The twins moved through it all in a state of quiet amazement, accepting hugs and well wishes with shy smiles. But their eyes kept returning to Rudolph, as if making sure he was still there, still real. Later that morning, as the celebration reached its peak, Rudolph called for everyone's attention. The guests gathered in a semicircle on the lawn, with Hope and Hannah seated on small chairs at the center. Rudolph knelt before them, a leather folder in his hands. "Hope, Hannah," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion making his heart pound. "Today isn't just your birthday, it's our family's birthday." He opened the folder, revealing official-looking documents with gold seals. "These papers say that from this day forward you are legally my daughters. But there's something else." Rudolph turned to the last page, pointing to his signature line. Where once it had read simply Rudolph Cross, it now stated clearly, Rudolph Hope Hannah Cross. "I didn't just adopt you," he explained, his voice catching. "I took your names as my own. Because you two didn't just come into my home. You came into my heart and saved it." For one breathless moment, the twins stared at the papers, at the name that joined theirs with his. Then, as if a dam had broken, Hope and Hannah burst into tears. Not the quiet, hidden tears they had shed in corners of foster homes, but great, healing sobs of pure joy. They launched themselves into Rudolph's arms with such force that he nearly toppled backward. His arms wrapped around them both as they buried their faces against his shoulders. "You stayed," Hope cried, her voice muffled against his shirt. "You stayed. You stayed," Hannah echoed, the words becoming a chant between them. "You stayed. You stayed." Rudolph held them tighter, his own tears falling freely now. "And I always will," he promised. "Forever." Around them, there wasn't a dry eye to be found. Elena wiped tears from her cheeks, while Dr. Lillian Marks nodded in professional satisfaction at the healing she was witnessing. Sister Margaret Doyle clasped her hands in silent prayer of gratitude. The fear that had shadowed Hope in Hannah's eyes since the day they were abandoned, the certainty that everyone would eventually leave, was finally completely vanquished in the circle of their father's arms. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting golden squares across the marble countertops. Rudolph Hope Hannah Cross stood at the stove, a blue apron tied around his waist that read, "World's Best Dad." a gift from Elena that had once seemed like a joke but now felt like the most precious title he'd ever earned. "More blueberries," Hope called out, standing on a wooden stool beside him. She carefully dropped the tiny fruits into the pancake batter, some landing with perfect precision, others rolling across the counter. Hannah giggled from her position on Rudolph's other side, where she was in charge of stirring. "That's too many," she warned, but her eyes sparkled with delight at the mounting chaos. "No such thing as too many blueberries," Rudolph declared, winking at Hannah. He flipped a pancake with dramatic flair, sending it soaring perhaps a bit too high. It landed half off the spatula, folding awkwardly onto itself. "Dad!" both girls exclaimed at once, dissolving into laughter. Rudolph's heart swelled at the word dad, still so new on their lips, still so miraculous to his ears. The kitchen, once a pristine, unused showpiece in his mansion, was now gloriously messy. Flour dusted every surface, sticky maple syrup puddled on the counter, and batter splattered the stovetop. "This one looks like an elephant," Hannah announced, pointing to a misshapen pancake on the growing stack. "And this one's a heart," Hope added, tracing the vaguely heart-shaped outline of another. Rudolph smiled, knowing that just months ago these same girls had been too afraid to speak, too wounded to laugh. Now they created silly shapes in pancakes and called him Dad. Later that afternoon, though the summer sun still hung bright in the sky, Rudolph honored their request for a special story time. The three of them piled onto the window seat in the girls' bedroom, a storybook open across Rudolph's lap. "Once upon a time," he began, his deep voice soft with tenderness, "there were two princesses who were brave and kind." Hope and Hannah nestled against him, one on each side, their small bodies warm and trusting. As he read, Rudolph noticed their eyelids growing heavy, the excitement of yesterday's celebration and this morning's pancake adventure catching up with them. The story finished, but Rudolph continued to sit there, watching as both girls drifted into peaceful sleep. Their heads rested against his chest, their breathing deep and even. Around each of their necks gleamed the golden lockets he had given them, each containing the same photo of the three of them together. Eventually, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the room, Rudolph carefully extracted himself, laying each girl gently on her bed. He pulled soft blankets up to their chins, tucking them in with practiced care. Standing between their beds, Rudolph looked down at their peaceful faces. Hope's mouth was slightly open, Hannah's hand stretched toward her sister even in sleep. The matching lockets glinted in the soft glow of their nightlight. Rudolph bent down, pressing a gentle kiss to Hannah's forehead, then moved to do the same for Hope. "You were never unwanted," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You were always the ones I was searching for." Days turned into weeks and a new chapter of life unfolded. Rudolph, Hope, Hannah Cross no longer measured time by business quarters or investment returns, but by small, precious milestones. The first time Hannah initiated a hug without hesitation. The morning Hope sang loudly in the shower, unaware anyone could hear her. The afternoon they both fell asleep on the living room floor surrounded by crayons and paper, trusting enough to be vulnerable. The mansion transformed completely. Where once cold marble and untouched furniture had dominated, now colorful artwork adorned the walls. Mismatched furniture created cozy reading nooks, and toys occasionally cluttered the hallways. Rudolph wouldn't have it any other way. "Dad, look what I found," Hope called one morning, racing into the kitchen with a tiny bird's feather. She no longer hesitated before using the word Dad, and it never failed to make Rudolph's heart swell. Hannah followed close behind, her once guarded eyes now bright with excitement. "Can we put it in our nature collection?" she asked, her voice confident where once it had been barely audible. Rudolph knelt down, examining the feather with exaggerated interest. "Absolutely. I think it's from a blue jay," he said, gently tucking it behind Hope's ear. "It matches your eyes." Both girls giggled, a sound that had become wonderfully common in their home. Later that summer, while walking through the park, Rudolph pushed both girls on the swings, delighting in their squeals for him to push higher, higher. Their laughter carried across the playground, drawing smiles from other parents. An older woman on a nearby bench watched them for several minutes before approaching Rudolph with a warm smile. "You're so lucky to have such sweet daughters," she commented, nodding toward Hope and Hannah, who were now racing each other to the slide. Rudolph watched them for a moment, remembering the silent, frightened girls he had first met at St. Adelaide's. His heart filled with gratitude for how far they had all come. "No," he replied with a gentle smile. "I am the lucky one." The woman nodded, seeming to understand the depth behind his simple words. At sunset that evening, Rudolph suggested they take their dessert, homemade ice cream sundaes, out to the hill behind their home. The three of them sat side by side on a checkered blanket, watching as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Hope and Hannah's faces were illuminated by the golden light, their features soft and peaceful. Rudolph noticed how Hannah no longer flinched at unexpected sounds, how Hope's shoulders remained relaxed instead of tense with vigilance. "Look at all the colors," Hannah whispered, pointing to where pink and orange streaked across the darkening blue. "It's like the sky is painting just for us," Hope added, leaning against Rudolph's shoulder. Rudolph wrapped his arms around both girls, drawing them close as they watched the horizon together. Their silhouettes merged into one against the golden light. A father and his daughters, a family stitched together by choice, love, and enduring hope. No words were needed in that moment. The journey that had brought them together, from loneliness to belonging, from fear to trust, from emptiness to fullness, was complete. As the sun dipped below the horizon, it seemed to seal their promise to each other, forever. If you enjoyed the story of Rudolph, Hannah, and Hope, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.